Okay, let me start from the beginning. Because if I don't start from the beginning, none of what happened in that hangar makes any sense. And I know you've read the incident summary already. Commander Ockhaffer sent it up the chain before I even got back to my bunk, but the summary doesn't have the texture of it. It doesn't have the smell or the sound or the weight of standing in that room and watching a 40-kilogram predator cub release my boot and then fold itself onto the floor like it had been spoken to by something ancient. So humor me. Let me go back to the morning. I woke up at 4:30, station time. Harrick doesn't have a real day-night cycle. It's a transitional station, one of the older ones, built back when the corridor agreements were still being negotiated, and nobody was sure whether the Keth were going to sign or just keep lobbing plasma charges at survey drones. The lighting cycles are artificial, and they never quite convinced me. There's something about artificial dawn that feels thin, like the light knows it's lying. I've been stationed here 7 months and I still haven't gotten used to it. I showered in the officers' quarters block, 3-minute water ration, standard, and I got into my field uniform. Slate gray over jacket, the kind with the reinforced shoulder panels, because Keth stations run cold and the drafts in the corridor sections can get genuinely bitter. Boots were the standard issue Terran diplomatic pair, synthetic leather upper, composite sole, rated for moderate environmental variance. I mention the boots specifically because they matter later. You'll understand. I ate at the Joint Commissary on Level 4. It was early enough that only a handful of personnel were up. 2 Vrel technicians having what I can only describe as an argument conducted entirely through nasal vibration. A Terran maintenance engineer named Kofi, who I'd got to know over the past few months, because we both had the same weakness for the commissary's reconstituted coffee. And a pair of Keth junior soldiers in the far corner who were eating something that looked like compressed protein blocks and staring at their tablets. Kofi looked up when I sat down. "Big day?" he asked. He always asked. It was his version of good morning. "Maybe," I said. "Liaison briefing at 600, then escort duty through the lower hangar." He made a face, not a dramatic face, just the quiet face of someone who has spent enough time on a Keth station to understand what the lower hangar means. "Which delegation?" he asked. "Keth 7th Fleet," I said. "Junior officers and a diplomatic observer team. They're doing their own review of the Corridor 7 protocols. We're basically background." "Background," Kofi repeated, in the tone of someone who has heard that word used as a comfort before and found it wanting. He took a long sip of his coffee. "Just don't touch anything furry." That was his advice. That was the sum total of Kofi's wisdom that morning. Don't touch anything furry, and I laughed because at the time it seemed like a reasonable enough joke. The Keth brought their cubs along, sometimes young predators in the early stages of bonding training. It was considered normal, even respectful within Keth military culture. The cubs were supposedly well managed. Supposedly. I finished breakfast and went to the briefing. The 600 briefing was run by Lieutenant Saren Voss, our station's lead diplomatic coordinator. Saren was efficient and humorless in the way that only truly competent people can be, which is to say that the humorlessness was a kind of respect. She didn't waste your time with warmth because she assumed you were capable of generating your own warmth at home. I liked her. She stood at the head of the briefing table and pulled up a holographic display of the lower hangar complex and walked us through the day's schedule in 14 minutes flat. The Keth 7th Fleet delegation, 8 junior officers, 1 senior diplomatic observer, a Keth commander named Vrathsal, who I'd had limited prior contact with during the Corridor 7 negotiations 6 months ago. He was senior, methodical, not hostile but not warm either, somewhere in the middle, which in my experience is the most honest place a Keth officer can be. 2 other Terran liaisons were assigned alongside me. Petty Officer Tam Iruhan, who was quiet and precise and had 3 years of Keth language study behind him, and Dr. Lena Fassbender, who was technically a xenobiology consultant, but spent most of her time functioning as our cultural context resource, because she'd written her doctoral thesis on Keth bonding caste hierarchies, and could read body language in a species with no face, which is a skill that takes years and still mostly results in educated guessing. "Cubs?" I asked at one point during the rundown. Saren glanced at me. 2. Vrathsal's personal bonded pair are juveniles, approximately 14 to 18 months by Keth developmental staging, which is equivalent to somewhere around 3 to 4 years in mammalian predator terms, Lena finished, not looking up from her tablet. Old enough to be curious, young enough to be stupid about it. Old enough to bite, Tam added quietly. Old enough to bite, Saren confirmed. Standard protocol. Don't make sudden movements near the cubs. Don't crouch to their level, that reads as challenge posture. Don't make direct eye contact with them for more than 3 seconds. And for the love of the Terran diplomatic charter, do not reach toward them. I nodded. I wrote it down in my field notebook. I have a habit of handwriting things because I retain them better than screen notes. So I wrote down, no sudden movements, no crouching, no eye contact over 3 sec, no reaching. I did not write down, what if one of them bites your boot? Because that specific contingency did not seem worth writing down. The lower hangar of Viharak Station is not a pleasant space. It's functional, which is different. The ceilings are high, maybe 25 meters, and the walls are the original construction composite, a dark gray material that the Keth use in almost all their built environments because it retains heat at a frequency that's comfortable for their physiology while remaining slightly cool for most others. The lighting in there is amber spectrum, again for Keth comfort, which gives everything a sort of dim gold quality that sounds more romantic than it is. In practice, amber spectrum lighting in a hangar full of machinery and Keth military hardware makes everything look vaguely like it's about to catch fire. There were ships docked along the far berths, 3 Keth tactical scout vessels, compact and blade-shaped, the design philosophy of a species that evolved as ambush hunters and carried it into their engineering. Everything Keth is designed to approach from unexpected angles. Their ships are no different. Even docked, they look like they're about to move. We arrived at 7:30. The Keth delegation was already there. They'd come in through their own access corridor on the far side of the hangar, and they were arranged in the way Keth military units always arrange themselves when they're in mixed company. Senior officers at center, junior officers forming an outer arc, everybody angled slightly so that each individual has a clear sightline to every exit. It's not aggressive. It's just how they stand. Lena had explained it to me months ago. The Keth are a prey-origin species that evolved predator behavior through social structure rather than biology, which means their threat response instincts are complicated and layered in ways that can look aggressive to humans, but are actually just a very deeply ingrained form of spatial anxiety. Vrathsal was at the center. He was, and I want to be accurate about this for the record, genuinely impressive. Not in a frightening way. In the way that very old, very certain things are impressive. He was maybe 2.5 meters tall in the Keth way, which is elongated more than bulky, with the characteristic scaled-over crest ridge that marks senior Keth officers and the deep amber eyes that don't seem to blink at a frequency that makes biological sense. He was wearing his full diplomatic kit, the dark formal panels over the standard gray underlayer, decorated in the 7th Fleet insignia. He looked like someone who had been having important conversations in important rooms for a very long time. And then at the base of his left leg, essentially sitting on his foot, was a cub. I had seen Keth cubs before. In images, in briefings, once in person during a docking formality that lasted about 8 minutes. But I want to be specific about what a Keth cub actually looks like at 14 to 18 months of developmental staging, because I think it matters for what happens next. They are not small. That's the first thing people get wrong. When you hear cub, you think small. Keth cubs at that stage are roughly the size of a large earth dog, something in the range of a German shepherd, maybe a little broader through the chest. They are built lower to the ground than adult Keth, the musculature not yet fully extended into the vertical growth phase, which means they have a dense, compact quality. The scales are juvenile, softer than adult Keth scales, with a slight iridescent quality in the right light. This one was a dark gold green which caught the hanger's amber lighting and made it look like a piece of sculpture. Its head was broad and heavy for its body, the crest ridge barely started, and its eyes were the same amber as Vrathsal's but brighter. Young eyes, curious eyes. The second cub was a few meters away, sitting near one of the junior Keth officers, watching us arrive with the specific quality of attention that juveniles of most species deploy when something new walks into the room. Absolute, unblinking assessment. I noticed Tam tense up slightly when we came in. Not visibly, not in a way the Keth would likely read. But I'd been working next to Tam for 5 months, and I knew his particular brand of quiet, and this was the quieter quiet. Lena, by contrast, looked professionally interested in the way that xenobiologists always look professionally interested when they're in proximity to their subject matter. She was noting things I wasn't noting, filing them away. Vrathsal inclined his crest toward us, the Keth equivalent of a formal nod. I returned it with the small bow that is appropriate for a liaison officer greeting a senior Keth commander in a formal context, slight forward angle, hands open at the sides, hold for 2 seconds. I'd practiced that bow 300 times. It was automatic by now. The translator system on my wrist came alive as Vrathsal spoke. "Duchamp," the device rendered, in the flat voice that translation tech still hasn't fully solved for Keth. There's a resonance quality to their speech that the devices flatten out. "We are prepared to begin the review." "Honored Commander Vrathsal," I said, "on behalf of the Terran Diplomatic Liaison Division, we welcome your delegation to Corridor 7. It was scripted. It was supposed to be scripted. The first exchange in any formal contact is scripted because improvisation in diplomatic contexts is how you accidentally suggest that you consider someone's mother to be an honored enemy combatant, which in Keth culture is actually a compliment, but in the wrong register sounds like a declaration. We moved into the beginning of the review. I was walking 2 steps behind and to the left of Vrathsal. That's the escort position. And Tam was keeping pace with the junior officer translation duties, and Lena was doing what Lena does, which is watch everything and say very little. The review itself was administrative. Corridor 7 protocols are mostly about traffic management, docking allocations, and the inspection routines for transient vessels. Vrathsal had his own list of concerns he'd submitted ahead of time, 3 points about transit timing windows, and 1 about the calibration of the neutral space boundary markers. All reasonable. All the kind of thing that sounds bureaucratic, until you remember that the neutral corridor system is why the Keth and the Terrans are currently exchanging diplomatic visits instead of exchanging plasma fire. I was doing my part, answering, cross-referencing, making sure the translator was rendering my responses correctly, minding the space, doing everything right. And then the cub got bored. I felt it before I saw it. That's the honest truth. A slight drag on my left boot, not painful, just resistance. Like something had caught the heel. I looked down. The first cub, the dark gold-green one that had been sitting on Vrathsal's foot when we arrived, had, at some point in the preceding several minutes, broken away from its position, crossed the hangar floor in that low, dense-bodied way that juvenile Keth move when they're being exploratory, approached me from behind, and bitten down on my left boot. Not viciously, not aggressively. It was a juvenile bite, a testing bite. The kind of bite that says, what is this thing and can I eat it or play with it or is it going to be interesting? Keth cubs do this. Lena had mentioned it in passing once. In the context of this, is why you don't wear anything made of organic material around juveniles. My boots were synthetic leather on the upper, but the toe cap had a slight texture to it that I suppose was interesting. The cub had the toe of my boot in its jaw. Its front feet were planted on the floor. Its eyes were looking up at me with the bright, assessing quality of something that is genuinely curious and genuinely unconcerned about consequences. I froze. Not dramatically, not in a way that would read as a sudden movement, but every conscious part of me went still, because the briefing training kicked in and the briefing training said don't make sudden movements, and so I didn't. I just stood there with 40 kilograms of juvenile keth predator, testing the tensile strength of my left boot toe. I looked up very slowly and carefully to see whether anyone had noticed. Everyone had noticed. The entire keth delegation had noticed. Every one of Wrathsal's 8 junior officers had that specific orientation shift, bodies slightly repositioned, eyes converging, that in keth body language means full attention on one focal point. The 2 other keth soldiers near the far berths had gone motionless. Tam had stopped mid-sentence and was standing with the expression of someone who has just mentally reviewed every emergency protocol and found none of them particularly applicable to this exact scenario. Wrathsal had turned. He was looking at the cub, then at me, then at the cub again, and I could not read his expression with any confidence because keth faces don't operate on the same effective signals as human faces, but I can tell you that his crest had gone perfectly flat, which Lena had taught me was either deep calm or the precursor to something significant, and he was very, very still. The cub, oblivious to all of this, gave my boot a small shake, testing, curious. Its tail, the thick juvenile tail that keth cubs use for balance, was moving in a slow, rhythmic side-to-side that Lena would later tell me is a neutral exploratory behavioral marker, not aggression, just interest. I had a moment, and I want to be clear that this moment was perhaps 2 or 3 seconds long but felt considerably longer, where I considered my options. Option 1, withdraw my foot slowly and see what happened. Option 2, say something. Option 3, stand here and wait for someone with more relevant expertise to handle this. I was leaning toward option 3 when she moved. I hadn't tracked where Lena was in the preceding minutes. I'd been focused on the review, on Wrathsal, on my translation work. She had been doing what Lena always does, which is exist quietly in the ambient space of a situation and observe it. But she had, apparently, tracked the cub's movement from the moment it started across the hangar floor, because she was already positioned not close, not crowding, but at an angle when this happened. She moved to my left side, stopped about 3 meters away, and she looked at the cub. I want to describe what she did exactly, because I've thought about it many times since, and I still find it remarkable. She didn't crouch, she didn't reach, she didn't make a sound, not immediately. She stood at full height with the relaxed upright posture that Lena always has, which is the posture of someone who is comfortable occupying space, and she looked at the cub. And then she raised her right hand slowly, no sudden movement, a deliberate and measured gesture, and she extended one finger, her index finger, pointed it at the cub. Just that, one finger, extended, pointed directly at the animal that was currently chewing on my boot. The cub saw it, and it let go. That's the part that stays with me. It released my boot, not reluctantly, not startled into dropping it, but in the way that something lets go when it receives a signal it recognizes. It set my boot down. It straightened up onto all 4 feet. And then, and this is the part I keep coming back to, it sat down. Folded back into a sitting position, its broad head dropping slightly, its eyes going to Lena with an expression I cannot accurately describe, because I don't know enough about keth juvenile facial anatomy to translate it, but which looked for all the world like the expression of a child who has been caught doing something minor and knows it. And it made a sound. A whine, a small, low, descending sound, Not pain, not distress, just acknowledgement, like yes, I know, I know. The hangar was silent. I mean completely silent. 20-something beings in a large space, and none of them made a sound for what I estimate was somewhere between 5 and 8 seconds, which in a moment like that feels like considerably longer. Then Vrathsal spoke. His translator rendered it as, "She commands the young." Lena lowered her finger. She looked at Vrathsal. "My apologies, Commander," she said. "The cub was being curious. It meant no disrespect." Another silence, shorter this time. And then Vrathsal did something I had never seen a senior Keth officer do, in a formal diplomatic context, in my 7 months on Viharek Station. He brought his crest up, full extension, which in Keth body language is not aggression. It is deference. It is the signal that says I recognize authority. He inclined it toward Lena. "Just once, but fully. I'm going to pause the account here for a moment. And I know this is my debrief. I know you want the incident report. But Commander Akafer said I could tell it how it happened, and how it happened includes the context. Because what I want you to understand is what made that gesture significant." Vrathsal was the most senior Keth officer on that station. He had been a commander in the 7th Fleet for what Lena estimated was equivalent to 23 Terran years. He had been present at 4 of the 7 Corridor Agreement negotiations. He was not the kind of person, the kind of being, who inclines his crest to a Terran xenobiologist in the middle of a diplomatic review. But he did. And the reason he did, which Lena explained to me that evening when we were back in the officers' section, and she was eating whatever she eats when she's been doing intense observation all day, which appears to be noodles and silence, is that what she had done was not a trick. It was not a technique. It was not a diplomatic maneuver. It was something that in Keth culture has a specific and ancient meaning, the extension of natural authority, the command without pack standing. In Keth social structure, the ability to direct a cub that is not bonded to you, to assert behavioral correction without kinship or hierarchical right, is one of the oldest markers of what they call Vethra. There's no direct translation. Lena translated it for me as the quiet that makes things listen. It's not a title. It's not a rank. It's a recognition, an assessment, and it's one that in traditional Keth culture is reserved for certain kinds of beings, those who carry authority not through power but through something older and harder to name. Lena had not known in that moment that she was demonstrating Vethra. She had done what she did because the cub was chewing my boot, and she knew how to read Keth juvenile behavior well enough to know what gesture would communicate. She was applying knowledge. That's all she was doing. But Vrathsal saw something else. And apparently, so did everyone in that hangar. The rest of the review continued. I want to be clear about that because the incident summary probably makes it sound more dramatic than the operational reality. We didn't stop. Vrathsal gave his crest incline to Lena, the hangar exhaled, and then the commander turned back to the inspection agenda and picked up exactly where we had left off, in the middle of a sentence about transit timing windows for Class 4 cargo vessels. Like a switch had been thrown. Professional, steady, back to work. But something had shifted. I felt it in the texture of the air in that room, which I know sounds like metaphor but isn't entirely. The junior officers were carrying themselves differently. There was a quality to their attention when Lena spoke, and she spoke rarely, and only when directly addressed, because she understood exactly what had just happened even if she'd had no plan for it. That was different from the polite professional deference they'd been extending before. It was something more careful, more considered. The cub followed Lena at a distance for the rest of the inspection. Not close, not attached, but when she moved to a new section of the hangar for the next item on the review list, the cub would eventually drift in that direction too, staying maybe 4 or 5 meters back, watching. The second cub, the one that had been near the junior officers, came and sat next to the first one about 40 minutes in, both of them watching Lena. Tam leaned toward me at one point, very quietly, barely a movement, and said, Is she aware of what's following her? She's aware, I said, because I could tell from Lena's posture that she knew. She always knew what was in her peripheral field, but she didn't look at them. She let them follow. She let them make that choice. The review took another 2 hours after the incident. We covered all of Vrathsal's listed concerns, the transit windows, the boundary markers, and added 2 items that came up organically during the walkthrough of the southern berth section. Procedural things. Administrative. Important in the way that most important things are important. Not dramatic, just necessary. At the end, Vrathsal stood at the main access point of the lower hangar, the formal conclusion point of any inspection, and conducted the closing exchange. I gave the standard Terran diplomatic response. He gave the standard Keth acknowledgement, scripted, correct. Then he looked at Lena. The xenobiologist, his translator said, she will be present for the water corridor assessment next quarter. Lena looked up from her tablet. If Terran Command assigns me, Commander. Vrathsal was still for a moment. Then he said something that his translator rendered, and I want to put this in the record exactly as it came through, with the caveat that Keth to English translation in the diplomatic register is still imperfect, as we will note a preference. In Keth diplomatic protocol, noting a preference for a specific liaison is a formal act. It goes on record. It means that the requesting party considers the individual in question to have demonstrated qualities they consider relevant to continued dialogue. In 7 months on Viharak Station, I had never heard a Keth delegation note a preference for a specific Terran personnel member. Lena took that in without any visible reaction. She nodded. I'll inform my division, Commander. The delegation left through their corridor. The Cubs went with them, the dark gold-green one looking over its shoulder once as it moved through the access door, back toward where Lena was standing. A last look, a last assessment. Then they were gone. The 3 of us walked back to the officers' section in the ambient silence of post-event decompression. Tam let out a long breath when we cleared level 3. Not a dramatic exhale. Just the breath of someone who has been consciously regulating his respiratory pace for 2.5 hours and can finally stop. That, he said, was something. Boots fine, I said. The synthetic leather held. Lena didn't say anything until we reached the commissary corridor, and then she said, the Cub was testing the tooth hardness scale of new materials. They do it between 12 and 20 months. It's a developmental phase. Great, Tam said. It was doing science on Duchamp's boot. Something like that, Lena said, and she almost smiled. That evening I sat in my quarters and wrote up the incident notes. Not the formal report, Saren had the form for that. Just my own notes. The kind of notes I keep in the handwritten journal that I've been carrying since my first posting. Because there are things that forms don't capture, and I have a personal policy about capturing them anyway. I wrote, the Cub bit my boot. Lena pointed at it. It sat down and whined. Vrathsal lifted his crest. Something shifted in the room. Something I'm not sure I have the vocabulary to describe accurately. I keep thinking about the moment between the pointing and the sitting. That gap. Whatever happened in that gap. Whatever the Cub read in the gesture, whatever Lena communicated without sound or hierarchy or any formal authority, that's the part worth understanding. This is what the protocol manuals don't cover. Not the scripts, not the bow angles, not the eye contact thresholds. The thing that happened in that gap. We've been trying to talk to the Keth for 31 years. We've gotten better at the words. We haven't quite figured out the silence yet. There are 2 things I want to add to the formal record before I close this account, and I want to make sure they're noted clearly because I think they have operational implications. The first is about Lena. I don't want this incident to be framed as a diplomatic maneuver she executed, because it wasn't. She read a situation and she responded to it with the knowledge she had. The result was significant, but it was not strategic. She was not playing a long game. She was managing a juvenile predator that was chewing my boot. The fact that it landed the way it did is a function of how much she knows, and more importantly of how genuinely she carries that knowledge, not as performance, but as actual understanding. There's a difference. The Keth noticed the difference. I think we should pay attention to that. The second is about the cubs themselves, because here's what I keep coming back to. The cub let go when she pointed, not when Vrathsal looked at it, not when the junior officers noticed, not when I stood there with my boot in its mouth. It let go when Lena extended her finger and looked at it. 40 kilograms of juvenile Keth predator, in an environment full of its own bonded hierarchy, released my boot and sat down at the gesture of one Terran xenobiologist who has no formal standing in Keth's social structure, and no kinship bond to the animal, and no authority that any Keth protocol would recognize. And it whined, that small, low, descending whine, which Lena told me is not submissive, not exactly. It's more like acknowledgement, the sound a cub makes when it has received a message from someone it reads as worth receiving messages from. Whatever the Keth have that we're trying to figure out, whatever bridge we're trying to build, I think there might be something here. In that gap, in the whine, in the moment when something young and wild decided to listen. I don't know what to do with that yet, but I wrote it down. That's what I do when I don't know what to do with something. I write it down, and I wait for the understanding to catch up. I want to be accurate about what I actually did, because I've heard the version that's going around the station, and it's gotten romantically inflated. I pointed at the cub. That's all. I pointed at it because that particular hand posture, in the context of sustained eye contact and a relaxed upper body orientation, registers in Keth juvenile behavioral language as a boundary marker. I knew that because I wrote 68 pages of my thesis on it. If people want to find meaning in the boot-biting incident, they should find it in the fact that a species that was nearly impossible to communicate with 30 years ago now has juveniles that will respond to Terran body language. That's the real thing, not my finger. The 30 years. Dr. Lena Fassbender, opening statement of supplemental testimony. I'll give you my version. It's shorter than Mara's because I don't narrate things the way she does. She has that gift and I don't. Or maybe I just deploy it differently. What I remember is watching the cub track Mara's boot from about 6 minutes before it made contact. Keth cubs in the 12 to 20 month developmental phase have a very specific locomotion pattern when they're in exploratory mode. It's a low shoulder walk, weight shifted forward, pace about 60% of their normal transit speed. The cub had that pattern. I watched it triangulate from Vrathsal's position, across the open floor space, in a trajectory that was going to intersect with whoever was in the escort position on Vrathsal's left, which was Mara. I moved to be in a lateral position relative to that trajectory before the contact happened. I didn't announce it because announcing it would have required explaining it to people who were in the middle of a diplomatic review, and explaining things mid-review is how you derail reviews. When the cub bit down, I was already positioned. The hand gesture, the pointed finger, is something I've used with Keth juveniles once before, during a field observation session on Keth Prime about 4 years ago. At that time, I was observing a bonded family unit in a controlled research context, and one of the juveniles was interfering with my measurement equipment. The extended index finger in combination with sustained eye contact is, in Keth juvenile behavioral grammar, a boundary signal, but specifically a cross-status boundary signal, meaning it functions differently than a same-status or hierarchical correction. When a bonded adult corrects a cub, the signal set is entirely different. It involves posture, scent, vocalizations, sometimes physical touch. The pointed finger works specifically because it's a novel signal. It comes from outside the cub's established social grammar. That novelty is what makes it effective, paradoxically. The cub doesn't have a prepared response to it, so it falls back on the deep instinct layer, which in Keth, as in most social predators, codes unfamiliar authoritative signals as comply and assess. Sit down. Figure out what this is. Don't escalate until you have more information. The whine is the acoustic manifestation of that cognitive state. I want to put that in the formal record. The whine is not distress. It's not submission. It's the sound of a young animal saying, I received a signal, I'm processing it, I'm not escalating. It's actually a positive behavioral indicator. What I did not expect, and I want to be honest about this, was Vrathzal's response. I was aware of the crest incline in the moment. I registered it, filed it, and kept my expression neutral because breaking the neutral expression in that moment would have been a mistake. But I was surprised. Senior Keth military officers do not incline their crests to Terran diplomats in formal context unless they are in the closing ceremonies of a major agreement. It's not a casual gesture. It carries specific meaning. I spent 2 evenings after the incident reviewing my notes on Vethra, on the concept and its behavioral correlates, because I wanted to be certain I was reading the gesture correctly. I believe I was. Vrathzal recognized something in the cross-status command, not the technique of it, but what it implied. The degree of behavioral understanding required to successfully execute a cross-status correction on a juvenile from a different species is, within Keth epistemological framing, evidence of a particular quality of awareness. What they call Vethra, the quiet that makes things listen. I don't experience it as quiet. I experience it as 30 years of accumulated academic literature and 4 years of field observation, and the very specific memory of a juvenile Keth cub interfering with my survey equipment on a research station outside Keth Prime's third moon. I have a habit of watching things closely and thinking carefully about what I see. The Keth apparently find that recognizable. I don't know whether to be flattered or simply interested. I'm leaning toward interested, which is my default position. The operational implication I want to flag, and I've put this in my separate consultancy report, but I want it in this record too, is about cross-species behavioral transfer. The fact that the cub responded to a Terran gesture is significant. The neural plasticity window in Keth juveniles is wide during the 12 to 20-month phase. They are in an active period of social grammar acquisition. They are learning what signals mean. And this cub in a Terran diplomatic station is acquiring signals from both Keth and Terran sources simultaneously. That has implications. It means the next generation of Keth who are raised in mixed contact environments will carry behavioral grammar from both contexts. It means the work we're doing here is not just diplomatic. It's developmental. We are, right now, shaping what the Keth who grow up in this era understand as communicative possibility. That's worth knowing. That's worth writing into every report and every briefing and every training document we have. The cub bit a boot and sat down when I pointed at it. But the reason it sat down is 30 years of contact history, living in the body of one juvenile predator on a neutral space station in Corridor 7. That's what I wanted to say. I'm not a storyteller, I'm a language specialist, so this is going to be clinical. Apologies in advance. Tam Iruhan, prefatory note. For the record, I'm adding 3 specific observations that I believe are linguistically and contextually relevant, and that I don't think are fully captured in the preceding testimony. First, when Vrathzal spoke the phrase that the translation system rendered as, she commands the young, the original Keth phrase was Vethra Sol Keth Amarid, which is more precisely rendered as, she holds the quiet that speaks to young ones. The translation system compressed it because our diplomatic translation protocols default to functional equivalence, but the full phrase carries a specific register that the compressed version loses. Vethra is a concept word in classical Keth. It appears in the founding agreements of the Keth hierarchy and in their oldest recorded military doctrines. Vrathzal did not say she commands. He said she holds something. That distinction matters. Second, the phrase Vrathsal used when noting a preference for Dr. Fassbender's continued assignment, rendered in the translation as "we will note a preference," was in the formal binding register of Keth diplomatic speech, not the advisory register. That is the register reserved for treaty language. He was not expressing a preference. He was lodging a formal petition. Whether Terran Command chooses to treat it as such is an administrative question, but linguistically it was a petition, not a preference. Third, I was watching the second cub when the first one released the boot. The second cub, the one that had been near the junior officers, had not moved at all during the incident. It had been watching. When the first cub sat down and whined, the second cub's tail stilled. And then, approximately 2 seconds after the whine, the second cub oriented its body toward Dr. Fassbender. Not its head, its body. The full-body orientation in Keth is not a social acknowledgement. It's a tracking behavior. The kind reserved for things that have been assessed as significant. I don't know what weight to assign these observations. That's above my pay grade, but they seemed relevant to put in writing. That's all I have. Brief administrative notation for the archive record. As of this writing, 62 days following the lower hangar incident documented in the preceding testimony, the following developments are on record and considered relevant to this file. The Keth 7th Fleet delegation returned to Viharak Station 18 days after the initial incident for the first portion of the water corridor assessment. The Terran Assignment Board had not yet received the formal petition from Vrathsal's delegation when the return visit was scheduled, and Dr. Fassbender was not initially assigned to the review team. Vrathsal's delegation arrived, conducted the pre-session formalities, and then, through the standard liaison channel, submitted an inquiry as to the status of the xenobiology consultant. When informed she had not been assigned to the current session, Commander Vrathsal requested a 24-hour delay in proceedings. The delay was granted. Dr. Fassbender was reassigned to the review team within 6 hours. The water corridor assessment proceeded the following morning without incident, completed 3 hours under scheduled timeline, and produced a joint protocol document that had been stalled in negotiation for 11 months. Both cubs were present at the second review. The dark gold-green one, the one that had bitten the boot, tracked Dr. Fassbender's position for the first 40 minutes of the session, before apparently concluding that she was going to be there for a while, and settling into a resting posture near the third berth station. Lena reported to me afterward that it followed her to the commissary corridor when the session ended. She said she stood at the access door for a moment, and then she crouched down, breaking the protocol rule about crouching, and looked at it. And it looked at her, for about 10 seconds, and then it turned and went back into the Keth corridor. She said she didn't know what to make of it. I told her she didn't have to make anything of it yet. That sometimes things happen and you just put them in the record and let time sort out the meaning. She said that sounded like something Duchamp would say. I told her Duchamp has her moments. The incident documented in this file, colloquially referred to by station personnel as the boot incident, has been reviewed, verified, and formally entered into the Terran Diplomatic Archive under classification level, restricted. No formal disciplinary action recommended. No operational protocols violated by any Terran personnel. The unauthorized crouch by Dr. Fassbender during the second review session is noted and waived given contextual circumstances. This document is recommended for circulation to the Terran Diplomatic Training Division as a case study in cross-species behavioral dynamics, specifically regarding the value of deep specialist knowledge in contact situations. It is further recommended for the attention of the First Contact Methodology Board, who are currently revising the Chapter 7 protocols on nonverbal communication in Keth diplomatic contexts. Specific recommendation on record: Dr. Lena Fassbender's understanding of Keth juvenile behavioral grammar contributed demonstrably to the stabilization of a contact moment that could have been interpreted as an affront under Keth diplomatic custom. It did not destabilize. It elevated. We should pay attention to how. One final note, personal rather than administrative, which I'm including because I believe it belongs here. I've been reviewing contact records for 11 years. I have read a lot of incident reports. Most of them describe things going wrong and the subsequent management of wrongness. This one describes something going right, not through protocol, not through scripted response, but through a person who knew enough about a species to understand the moment they were in, and who acted from that understanding without hesitation. That's the job. At its best, that's exactly the job. We have a long way to go with the Keth. 31 years of contact history, and we're still learning the grammar of each other. But somewhere in Corridor 7, there's a juvenile Keth predator who carries the memory of sitting down when a Terran pointed at it. Who chose, for reasons that live in the deep instinct layer of its developing mind, to listen. That's something to build on. It's small, but so are most of the things that matter before they matter.